By the way, Ben, did you see that story? No surprise, because anybody who reads all the, military magazines and everything knows that this stuff was in development, but scary to think about it coming to a town near you. The drones that they've been working on that are the size of small birds and can look like them are ready. They're going to start deploying these in testing situations. And, of course, first they'll use them in security situations like overseas, but in the same way that they're using drones now domestically, and that will be expanded over time, mark my words, they're going to start using the little ones that look like birds, too. It's funny. James Burke, the great scientific historian, wrote a book with another guy called The Axe Maker's Gift. And in much of his work, he's done this similar stuff where he kind of wonders whether or not human beings can see where their technology is taking them and decide to not go there. If you look in the future and go, wow, if we continue researching this, we're going to invent a bomb so big we can destroy the earth. Let's not go there. Can you even do that? There are fantastically interesting case examples of people trying to decide that changes in the world would screw up their society so much that they didn't want to go there. Japanese history has an example of that. When firearms were first brought to Japan, they were readily adopted. They started being used in the armies, in the wars that Japan fought amongst, the various feudal lords in Japan. They were used in some overseas adventures as well. But then at some point, the Japanese in their society, that was so based around certain codes and swords and, an almost feudal sort of system, felt threatened by these guns to a point where they decided they didn't want them anymore. And because they had only a couple of ports where they allowed stuff to be brought in the country, they were able to sort of turn back the clock. They did something even a bigger deal than looking ahead and saying, do we really want to keep researching down this road? They looked at something that was already a part of their lives and said, you know what, we don't want this anymore. And only the fact that they were so able to control imports into the country and whatnot were they able to make that work. But it's one of the few examples where you can go, wow, do such options really exist to the rest of us? If you didn't like the idea of these little bird drones spying in our country to protect us from terrorists on every street corner, what could you do about that? More on our inability to address anything like that a little bit later on in the show. Back to the situation in Libya. There was an interesting constitutional face-off, and I guess you could say maybe some elements are still continuing, between the president and the Congress over the legality of what we're doing in Libya. There's something called the War Powers Act that was passed in the early 1970s when Richard Nixon was embattled politically and weakened, that was intended to try to mitigate some of the problems that had developed in this country since the Korean War. In 1950, Harry Truman took us into the Korean War without declaring war. He doesn't declare war. The Congress declares war. But normally, the president would go to Congress and say, we need to declare war, or Congress would declare war, and then the president becomes the commander-in-chief under the Constitution in running the war operation. Now, Harry Truman got around this constitutional requirement that the Congress decides when the country goes to war. After all, it's the more representative body, by just saying that the war in Korea wasn't a war at all. He renamed it a police action. A police action wasn't specifically covered in the Constitution. Hence, the war in Korea that cost more than 30,000 American dead was pretty much a decision that one man was able to make himself by changing the definitions of what constitutes war. Since that time, we have never declared war again. But I think we all know we fought a few. This has become a constitutional loophole. Now, usually what happens is a president will go to the Congress and ask for some sort of support. Can we get a resolution supporting what we're doing or whatever? And then this becomes the fig leaf where the president can say, yes, I know war wasn't declared, but look, Congress declared in the resolution their adherence to the goals of the mission, blah, 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 blah. We've seen that now many times. The president is never going to go to Congress again and ask that they declare war so that he can take the nation into a conflict. The reason why is over the last 50, 60 years, the presidency's taken that power from Congress, and they're not going to give it back. The reason that they don't want to comply with the War Powers Act, and if you read the language, it's wonderfully tortured, is because the presidents, ever since the War Powers Act was passed, have said that they're not going to be bound by it, that's a illegal encroachment on the rights of the president. What it really means is it's an encroachment on the rights the president has stolen since the Second World War, but they're not giving it back. President Obama is no different than President Bush or President Clinton or the other President Bush or Reagan, that they have war-making authority, and if Congress doesn't like it, they can cut funding off, right? Congress has the power of the purse, Dan. They can stop this war anytime they want to. Well, more on stopping the war in Libya in a second, but let's imagine that Congress decided they wanted out of Afghanistan, and more than just the surge. They want, we want out of Afghanistan tomorrow, Mr. President. And the president says, well, I'm not doing that. To heck with you. And so the Congress says, well, we have the power of the purse. We will not give any more money until, the troops are brought home. Think about that for a minute, ladies and gentlemen. There is no such thing as the power of the purse. You don't cut money to troops the troops in the field aren't going to have bullets or food. Congress is really going to do that. When you realize how absurd the idea is that Congress would ever do that, you realize that this power of the purse thing is a complete myth. Unless you're talking about a situation where we don't actually have troops on the ground. Brings us back to Libya, doesn't it? This is a situation where the power of the purse could be employed, creating a precedent. These are important. Congress has very few of these precedents on their side in the last 50 or 60 years, creating a precedent where they actually do overrule the president on an issue of national security. Congress needs to do that. If they cut off funding to the situation in Libya, we would not be able perhaps to fly drones. We would not be able perhaps to provide support for troops on the ground that are there, but it would send a very good constitutional message to the executive branch. And it would not be the same as leaving our troops in the field without bullets and meals and support. Now, there are interesting things that might happen at this point if history's any judge. People forget now what the Iran-Contra thing that happened in the middle 1980s with the Reagan administration was all about. It was all about trying to get around Congress deciding that they didn't want to pay for the foreign policy ideas that the Reagan administration was employing in Central America. The Reagan administration and their head of the CIA during this period, a guy named Bill Casey, were in love with the Nicaraguan Contras, which was an insurgency force funded with American dollars. So at a certain point, Congress cut off the money. They did that power of the purse thing. And the president, in order to find the money for the operations, sold weapons to Iran, which was our adversary at this time, just like it is now. And there had been prohibitions written into the law specifically disallowing things like that. Sold weapons to Iran, took the money that Iran gave them for the weapons, gave that money to the Contras in Nicaragua so they could continue operations even though the Congress wasn't going to pay for any of that. That's a possibility in Libya. If the president goes that route, he should be brought up on charges. Reagan should have been brought up on charges. His people were. Oliver North, Poindexter. I love how guys like Poindexter, they do this crime, they get convicted of this crime, and now they go back and work for government at very high levels. He helped design a lot of the national security agencies' domestic surveillance programs. Same crop of people. Isn't it always funny, Ben? Those guys they can go to prison and they come back and they're put in, positions most Americans couldn't even sniff at. Especially not with a criminal record. Now, the rationale that the Obama administration is using to not just not comply with the War Powers Act, but to pretend like they're not even dealing with it. Remember, if they even acknowledge that such a constraint exists on the executive as the War Powers Act, they are backsliding in terms of presidential powers. So they've got to write all of their rationales with the whole idea that we're just going to pretend that nobody even brought up this law that every president disagrees with, right? The president says there is no war in Libya. Hence, there is no need for anything involving, Congressional War Fighting Authority to be involved. If you don't like it, use the power of the purse, is what's implied. Congress is implying that they will. consider it for once. And in the same way that I said, sometimes election, it's not election year anymore, obviously, but it's, we're running up to the election even now. And so all these decisions are predicated upon payoffs by the presidential election in 2012. You get some good things sometimes. From the president, we get the beginnings of a move away from, troop deployments in Afghanistan, and at least rhetoric that implies that we understand that, finances and other things require something like this. The rhetoric is better than nothing. And on the congressional side, you're getting a little pushback from Republicans. Guys like, Boehner are even on this bandwagon, but it's all for political reasons. Believe me, if this was another Republican in the White House, this whole thing would just be reversed and, you'd have all the Republicans. I mean, John McCain's the only one there saying, what happened to the interventionist Republicans? These people have forgotten. It's our mission to spread, our value, blah, blah, blah. So again, election year politics giving us some good moves, even if they're just for show. Isn't that funny, Ben? We've come to a point in this country where even though the motives are completely cynical and subverted and hidden, the rhetoric, at least, is a fig leaf that makes me feel better about where we are. Just give me a fig leaf at this point. I'll take anything. The Congress should cut off the funding for Libya. And let's have a constitutional crisis. Because right now, this country needs a constitutional crisis. We need some pushback and face-off where we get to have an issue like the questions of when the country goes to war and who makes those decisions get as much attention as Anthony Weiner's tweeted photograph of himself did.